EldenRing Nightreign came out about 3 weeks ago, and initially its reception was pretty mixed. However, as time went on, people began to warm up to it, and overall it has a pretty good reception. Despite this, it is going to be within the shadow of both EldenRing and all the other FromSoft Soulsborne games, with many people seeing the reuse of several assets as well as the EldenRing title as kind of a cheap cash grab, and personally I see that claim as a bit disingenuous. However, despite all this, the game is actually pretty good. In fact, one could argue it does a lot of things better than EldenRing and even other FromSoft titles. Now, I will admit, the game is not perfect and may not suit everybody because it does lack the much more modular style you get from the other FromSoft games, and it's not the same long drawn out Odyssey either, as it goes for a much more roguelike approach. However, it's critical to look at the success of this game and where it did well in, and to praise it to hope these changes make it in future titles, especially since FromSoft actually looks at what people say. So what does this game actually do better than EldenRing? Well, quite a few things. First of all, one, it has a much better balance, and this here goes to status effects, this goes to weapons, and this goes to character archetypes. The game also has a much better netcode, a much better character class design, and better archetypal balance. The exploration of the game is done so much better, specifically with the travel speed throughout the map. And not only that, the replayability as well as the multiplayer balance is incredibly well executed, to the point where dying in the game is punishing, but it doesn't feel unfair. The boss fights feel much more grandiose and cinematic without degrading the quality of the gameplay. So let's start off with the biggest improvement, and that is going to be status effect balance. In Elden Ring's base game, Bleed was the king of status effects, followed by Frostbite. After that, Poison was that good. Rot, it was better than Poison, but it wasn't that good. However, in Nightreign, none of them are overpowered, but they're all pretty good to the point where none of them really overshadow each other. And this includes Poison, which pretty much means that this game actually incentivizes different build types, especially based off of every single run. Unfortunately, in Elden Ring, it was pretty much either Blood, Frostbite, or go home. You really don't want to be building the Serpent Bone Blade or the Serpent Bow. Yes, it can be used to cheese certain encounters, but it really wasn't worth it. Because anything you get out of Poison or Scarlet Rot, we're better off just swinging a weapon with a higher AR to begin with. You get much more damage from the weapon, and not only that, if you go for a Bleed build or a Frostbite build, you'll just do more damage anyways. The only reason why you'd want a Poison build in Elden Ring normally is just to poison people for PvP, which only really worked because of the abuse of the netcode, which effectively felt like cheating if you had really bad connection. However, now all stat specs are good and they're pretty much about as good as each other. And this right here gives an access to much more meaningful decisions within the game's design. And on top of that, we also have a much better balance between different classes. I mean, we have bows that are actually good in a FromSoft game. And this is without invalidating spells. Spells perform a completely different purpose. And on top of that, we have a much better balance between different types of archetypes. And this is talking about more the stat distribution, which doesn't really matter as much in this game since it's based off of the specific character class you're playing than anything you're building. However, it does kind of matter when it comes to a variety of playstyle, because whenever you play any of these individual characters, the experience is very different, as it almost feels like you're playing a completely different game, almost reminiscent of a hero shooter, but done even better, because it's not cutting out your options, but incentivizing different options for different directions. And while there is an easy argument that some of these classes are better than others, because, well, unironically, some of them are, but it's not to a point where it's egregious. And unironically, even if one of these classes are better than another, it doesn't mean that they could completely take over what the other character's niche is. And I believe this is highlighted within their skills and abilities. In fact, they ended up making stealth something that was actually kind of enjoyable in a FromSoft game, rather than making it a one-time cheese mechanic or something that you really only use on light tier PvE. And while the ability to grapple, the ability to summon, the ability to do all this stuff right there is really cool, what really makes it insane is what the relics could do on top of that. A great example of this is the Executor can actually get a bestial roar that could heal their allies as part of their ult. In fact, almost every single character, be it part of their relic or part of their abilities, has the ability to help out an ally in absolutely insane ways. And the overall performance is relatively similar, even though all these characters have different gameplay styles and they synergize differently into each other. A good way to put it is this game has a lot of synergies. You have a character like the Exeter, which does an amazing job with somebody like the Duchess on the team, doubling down the bleed procs. And that's just one out of many. A character like the Recluse, for example, could play as a support and a lifeline for Revenant whenever she's struggling with mana. And Iron Eye can work as a very strong debuffer for pretty much anyone in your team, increase the damage by providing a weak point. And honestly, everything that's done with this balance and this synergy really helps with the game's vibe and feel, especially since this right here kind of goes into also the character designs outside the game in terms of the comedy and the moments that make it worth cherishing. Characters like the Revenant carrying a colossal weapon, despite the fact it's not optimal, it is absolutely hilarious. And when you get moments where the team's relying on one person to save them all, especially with the Duchess with her invisibility, the Revenant with her Scream Revive, and the Burb flying up to the air to revive everyone from zero. It just feels great because it creates a moment that's worth remembering. Compare this to EldenRing, which I love EldenRing as a game, but there was very fewer moments like this. Yes, of course you got the Let Me Solo Hers and somebody else who can carry you in a funny way, or somebody like the Drip Inspector. However, this is a little different because it's a lot more cinematic. As you're not just being carried, you're being helped by somebody lending you a hand. And this is not the only thing that makes the multiplayer in this game absolutely great, because you also have the ability to ping, split up, and work together in order to accomplish either the same goal or different goals depending on the context. And because there's this pressure, this rush, it feels much more engaging to play with the other players. And this right here leads into times where players can leave to complete an objective that they get to finish off alone while the other players do a very critical objective like killing a boss. Meaning sometimes a player could sacrifice a lot of runes in order to prevent, let's say, a massive debuff, to prevent people from losing levels and to gain those levels back, or to go to the fortress to find the map, to find the core of the rot in order for everyone to get that buff. And for those people who make that sacrifice to take out their own runes, their own levels, etc., to help others out, thank you, because you just made somebody's day. Now, there's other multiplayer things that are fixed as well within the game, specifically within better netcode and better connections. So therefore, you're having less times where people are timing out, disconnecting randomly. And while it still happens, it happens much less in the base game. And while this doesn't seem like much, I do want to note that EldenRing itself is a peer-to-peer game, which means you're connecting directly to the other person's computer and sending information that way rather than have a dedicated server, making the improvements we see in Nightreign kind of a really big deal. These improvements, if they're implemented in later games, it could solve a lot of the Soulsborne combat, especially since one of the biggest issues in EldenRing right now is the fact that rot, poison, etc., still build up even on phantom hits. What's another major improvement in this game is also just the changes in terms of a lot of scaling. Another major improvement in the game, and I will say this again, I know it's going back to weapon scaling, but all the hybrid weapons actually feel like they're hybrid weapons rather than just scale one stat. Making a weapon like the Glintstone Chris, the Blade of Cullen, etc., they do not feel like they're just int weapons or faith weapons, they feel like they're hybrid weapons. And for faith builds, they do have pure faith weapons, meaning they're really not losing out. And unlike EldenRing, it doesn't risk eclipsing the other archetypes. Now, there is a bit of an issue where you cannot check the weapon scale in-game. You actually have to go outside of a match and look it up on the journal, the guide, or over on the chest to see what the actual scaling is. And in my opinion, that's a bit of a problem because you have something like the Guardian Sword Spear, which scales on dexterity to an S scaling, despite the fact that the majority of the halberds in the game are quality. So the lack to be able to see what the scaling is in-game as well as to see what your stats are in-game makes it much more frustrating if you're trying to optimize. And strangely enough, this stuff actually applies to not just the Guardian Sword Spear, but 6 other weapons. Now here's the thing, the strange scaling only happens with dexterity, faith, and arcane weapons. Everything else has a pretty consistent trend. That's just a pet peeve of mine. But anyways, back to the video, and this time let's go ahead and talk about something else this game does exceptionally well compared to Elden Ring, and that is going to be the gameplay loop and exploration. One of the strongest parts and the weakest parts about Elden Ring is the fact it's a very big game. And Nightreign is the same. However, Nightreign, your character travels a lot faster. Now this right here may not seem like a fair complaint because Elden Ring has to be balanced for PvP, right? In addition, this sounds like you could jeopardize exploration. However, there's ways to give shortcuts and ways to increase speed without jeopardizing exploration. In fact, this has been solved pretty well with Nightreign with both the Spirit Hawk and the ability to climb. Now let's talk about the coup de grace, what actually makes this game so different than Elden Ring, and that is actually bosses, specifically all of the Night Lords. The reason why is because Elden Ring, they did an amazing job in bosses. In fact, every Soulsborne game did a great job in bosses, at least for the relative time they came out. Yes, I understand that Dark Souls 1 didn't really age too well, and some bosses in Dark Souls 2 are questionable. However, when you look at Nightreign, specifically the Night Lords, they feel like they're on a different level. They feel like Eldritch Abominations, and while not every single one of them is a banger, specifically Augur feeling very much like the Elden Beast. Not as bad, but very close. They all have different vibes, and even Augur has a saving grace. And that is because the fight is calming until it starts doing something, then it's kind of terrifying to fight. Especially when you see that bubble coming down and you know that thing is a nuke, and if you don't leave, you're getting wiped. And when it starts going to sleep, then you know you're going to sleep as well. And unlike them, you ain't waking up. In fact, every single one of these fights is an Eldritch Abomination. And yet, despite the intensity, despite the cinema of all this, you have the same control as a Soulsborne character, not some sort of partially scripted hack and slash. In addition, it's harder to script the fight compared to any regular Soulsborne game. In fact, a fight against any of the Night Lords, every single fight feels like an intense fight against a god. And like any other FromSoft game, it is much harder to cheese these guys. You actually have to fight these bosses, and honestly, whatever weapon you have is based off of your run, which means every single run, you look at the best way to optimize your build every single time. And each time, it's going to be different based off of your run. And due to the fact it is much harder to actually get a 10-second victory, the bosses will almost always feel like bosses, unlike EldenRing, where if you optimize too well, the boss fights kind of become too easy. Now, the final thing to talk about is actually going to be the Dark Sovereigns, because honestly, specifically the introduction to a harder version of boss fights that also allow you to explore more of the game's mechanics and use it within the fights. For example, the Spirit Springs, which allows you to jump into the Eye of the Storm in order to fight the boss from there. And so far, the Dark Sovereign is much more cinematic than the previous one, and it actually does kind of feed into that chaotic mess where you do not know what is going on. In fact, the only reason why I'm not upset about this boss dropping my frame rates to 0 is from the fact that it adds in that extra bit of chaos. However, that is just an excuse. They really do need to optimize or remove some of those particle effects to at least streamline it a little bit more to be much more optimal for modern PCs. And these periodic bonus hunts, honestly, that's a great idea because it adds a level of exploration, a reason to come back to the game. And this is a much bigger deal since more and more games are being made live service. Which, yes, it does have its issue as a service model type. It could really make the game feel much more engaging to invest into, knowing that the game is going to have future updates, which is going to keep the community alive. And that is what I feel like Nightreign did better than EldenRing. Now, here's the thing. Nightreign does have its issues, and of course, it is much more restricted. You do play pre-made characters, you're not making your own, which is something which I'm not a big fan of. However, I love the characters and the personalities they have, along with the stories. I just hope that when FromSoft goes to make another RPG once again, they look at what they did well in this game and implement it. But hey, that is just my take. I could be horribly wrong. So tell me, what do you like about this game, what they could have done differently, and what you want to see in future installments? And please consider liking and subscribing, and have an awesome day.